Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Quarantine Book Talks. We've played around with quarantine, quarantine-ish, post-quarantine. I'm giving up on guessing where we are in all of this, but we'll just call it the Quarantine Book Talks for now. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so happy to be back with you tonight for the first session of our winter QBT series. I've really missed these gatherings over the last few weeks. Please introduce yourself in the chat box. Say hello. Make sure to chat to everyone, not just to hosts and panelists. Also, the chat box is where you can put your questions to add to our conversation later on this evening. You can drop them in there at any time, and I'll bring them in when we're ready. We are delighted to be able to continue offering this program and growing this community, which has come to mean a lot to us and to so many over the past 2 years. I also want to thank Jewish Live for their partnership. Before I introduce our featured author for this evening and we begin our conversation, I want to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us understand the world we live in and create a better future. The Quarantine Book Talks are just one aspect of JWA's work. I hope you will check out our website, jwa.org, which is also our archive, or digital archive, to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. You can also find us, of course, on social media, where we have a lot to say on all platforms. I am delighted to welcome Helene Wecker, who is the author of 2 novels, The Golem and the Jinni, which was awarded the Mythopoeic Award for Adult Literature, the VCU Cabell Award for First Novel, and the Harold U. Ribelow Prize, and its sequel, The Hidden Palace, which just won a National Jewish Book Award. Helene holds a BA in English from Carleton College and an MFA in fiction writing from Columbia University. Her work has appeared in many different places, literary journals such as Joyland and Catamaran, as well as the fantasy anthology, The Jinn Falls in Love and Other Stories. She currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, which she is joining us from with her family, and she's joining us from there tonight. Welcome, Helene. So glad to have you with us.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here with so many wonderful participants.
Great. Yeah, we get a really great crowd. We love it. We love to see so many people from all these different places joining us. It's fabulous. So welcome, everyone.
I saw my aunt go by in the chat. Hi, Aunt Evelyn.
Yes, we keep it in the family. We have people from all over, and there's always some family members that show up, and people find each other's cousins in the chat, and it's a very active and communal place. So we're so excited to have you here with us tonight, and I would love for you to start us off by giving us just a little taste of The Hidden Palace.
Okay. So this is from near the beginning of The Hidden Palace. Hopefully it won't give away too much from The Golem and the Jinni if readers haven't, viewers haven't read that yet. At last, the first true freeze of winter arrived, and Central Park gave itself to the cold and snow. The vining roses were pruned back to a handful of canes. The elms on the mall grasped the sky with empty fingers. "I'm sorry," the Golem said one night as they neared the Harlem Mere. "This will be a long walk back, and it's starting to snow again." "Stop worrying about me," said the Jinni, "and stop apologizing. I can't help it. I feel like I'm putting you at risk. You aren't asking me to jump in a river, Chava. I can manage a little snow." She sighed. "It's just louder now, or it feels louder. Oh, it's hard to explain." She hugged herself as she walked, clearly miserable. With the onset of winter, her clay body had grown stiff and uncomfortable, an expected effect and manageable as long as she walked often enough. But now, like arthritic joints that ached with the rain, the scream in her mind, her trapped creator in his endless anger, had grown sharper, more distracting. She'd begun to make careless mistakes at the bakery, such as forgetting the raisins in the challah dough or doubling the baking powder in the cookies so that they swelled as large as biscuits. Thea Radzin thought it a lingering effect of her widowhood. With each mishap, she cast a pitying look at her favorite employee, thinking, and who could blame the girl if she came unhinged? "Do you think I'm coming unhinged?" the Golem asked suddenly. "Do I think what?" "That I'm coming unhinged. It's what Thea thinks, though of course she doesn't say it. And no, she doesn't understand, but you do. So you must tell me, please." He blew out an impatient and unnecessary breath. "Chava, you aren't coming unhinged, whatever that means. The winters are difficult for you. We knew this. It's all of a piece. And you're handling it far better than I would, where I'd hear that man screaming in my head all the time. You make it sound like he's hurling curses at me, she muttered. It's simpler than that, like a tinnitus, I suppose, just louder lately. Better here, though? She gazed about at the dark tableau of the park, felt with her distant senses the earth below them, its warmth banked and waiting. The seasons would turn, she reminded herself. Her body would lose its stiffness and unease, and her mind would quiet once more. Yes, she said, better here. Spring arrived as promised. The rains began, forcing them apart and indoors, she sewing in her room each night, he working in the shop. Without him, she grew restless. Her mind strayed toward the couples who hurried by outside, laughing beneath their umbrellas, their thoughts full of what might happen when they reached their warm apartments, their inviting beds. He, too, became tense and distractible, full of unsettled longings, uncertain of their welcome. He, who'd once sauntered up Fifth Avenue so confidently in search of Sophia Winston's mansion. And she, meanwhile, reviewed every conversation they'd ever had upon the subject of faithfulness, his opinions ringing in her mind like a punishment. Humans and their ridiculous rules. But she also recalled something that had happened before the rains had separated them, a night when they passed a Lower East Side synagogue just as two women, clear at a glance as mother and daughter, emerged from its basement stairwell. The daughter's hair had hung down her back in damp coils. She'd shivered in the night air, nervous and excited, her pale face glowing. The older woman had put a comforting arm around her, and they'd hurried down the street together, mother whispering to daughter, the daughter nodding. It's late for a bath, isn't it? The Jinni had said as they disappeared. It's a mikveh, a ritual bath, she told him. And then, at his confusion, by Jewish law, a woman mustn't lie with her husband during her menses. Once it's ended, she immerses herself in the mikveh and recites a blessing. Brides do it too, before the wedding ceremony. Ah, and the younger one? She marries in the morning. She'd waited for him to call it absurd or superstitious or any of his other usual complaints, but he'd only nodded as though half listening, his expression entirely opaque. Perhaps, she thought at her window, watching the rain, perhaps.
Thank you so much. There is so much richness in this story with the interplay of these mythological creatures from two different traditions and then the historical. And maybe we could just start by, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you even came up with this idea, like why a golem and a Jinni, and to add on to that, why a female golem in particular, given that in the tradition, usually golems are male.
Yeah, and that's, it was definitely sort of, I knew I was putting a bit of a twist on it with that. So the way that it came about was that, well, to go back to the very beginning, which is like, oh gosh, 15 or so years ago now, I was getting my master's in fiction at Columbia University in New York. And I had gone sort of at the end of one career and sort of embarking on what I was hoping was going to become a writing career. And I had been completely blown away by getting into Columbia. I figured I was just throwing $75 away on the wind, and they would send me, a rejection letter, which I would frame and, hang up. But what happened, they let me in. And then when you get to Columbia, pretty much it's told you like from the beginning, okay, you have 2 years here. And then a few years, 2 years of coursework, you're 2 years in New York, and then you need to turn in a thesis after a few years. So what is your thesis going to be? And so I was working on this collection of short stories that was going to be my thesis. And it's not like a doctorate thesis or anything. It's your body of work, of fiction. And so I was writing these very realist short stories, sort of like MFA, the Raymond Carver very realist model, that were drawn from my family history and my husband's family's history. And I'm Jewish. I grew up in suburban Chicago. He is Arab American, grew up in also suburban Chicago, about 45 minutes away. And we didn't meet till college. And then when we did meet, and we got to know each other, and we started to like find out more about our families, each other's families, and so on. What had always struck me was the patterns that kept popping up and repeating between our families around immigration and coming to America and issues of like language and culture, and then, you know, growing up as the children of immigrants, and having that sort of, that weirdness sort of handed down to you, and always feeling like you're a little off, and maybe living sometimes with like the cultural memory of a place you've never been to. And so I wanted to write about this because this really interested me. And the way I decided I was going to do it was these short stories. And it was like, there was this Jewish girl and this Arab American boy who sort of threaded through these stories, and they would meet up every once in a while. But the problem that I started to run into was that the stories weren't very good. I just wasn't a very good writer yet, was part of it. I was still getting my training wheels. But also, you know, it's one of these things where I wasn't discovering it as I was writing it because I knew these stories already. Or, you know, they were either lightly fictionalized or, you know, a little more heavily fictionalized, but it was like, I already knew the heart of it. And that was stuff, and so they just sort of lay there on the page because it was like, you could see me trying to get to the point already instead of really exploring what was going on. And so I was complaining about it to a friend of mine who was in the workshop, and she said, she at one point just sort of turned to me and she said, Helene, why are you writing like this? I'm like, what am I writing like? I didn't know I was writing like a thing. And she said, yes, you're writing the MFA short story about your families. When I know you and I know what a total nerd you are, I have been to your apartment, I've seen your bookshelves, I know what you read. You were always talking in class about the uses of the fantastical and folklore and mythology and all of that. And why aren't you doing that? Because that's your thing. And it had never really occurred to me. And it's one of those things where it's like, you wonder afterwards, I don't know why. I have no idea why. But she said, okay, here's what I want you to do. The next thing you bring to us in workshop, I want it to be about your families. It can be about your families if you want, but I want it to be fantastical. It's like, okay. So I went home and I was like, okay, I've got my orders. And I sat there, I was like, okay, so what if we sort of Neil Gaiman this up here? What if instead of the Jewish girl and the Arab American boy, what if we turn them into like fantasy creatures? What if we make them a girl golem and a boy Jinni? And I could see them pretty much instantly. They were like, it was like this tall woman with you know, who looked sort of shy, and this equally tall man who looked like kind of a bad boy. And I was like, ooh, okay, what am I going to do with you two? And it was like instantly I could feel myself getting excited about it. And so I was like, okay, I'll put you in New York at the turn of the 20th century, and you're going to run into each other on the street. And so I, like, literally by that night, I had written the first like dozen or so pages of what became the Golem and the Jinni. And what was so cool about that was that it really opened up the whole thing for me, because I could suddenly talk about these issues in a way that was like externalizing it. It wasn't about people I knew anymore. It wasn't about my stories anymore. It was like, it did the thing that folklore and fantasy does, which is it allows you to sort of take the stuff that's in here, put it out there, look at it, you know, in like a lens that's like larger than life, and make everything about it larger than life. So, you know, it wasn't just, you know, we're new to New York, we're, you know, new to Manhattan. It's we're new to being people, and we have to figure out how to eat and that sort of thing. So that was sort of what drove me to do this, to write this thing that I thought was going to be just a short story, and then turned into like a pretty big novel, and I had to do a lot of research about it. But yeah, that was it. And then about the girl golem, I knew that, you know, at first it was just that she was going to be, you know, in that mirror of my life. If you're in a heterosexual relationship and you've got the boy Jinni, then you need a girl golem. And so, but at that point, it's like, okay, you've got a girl golem in 1890s or early 1900s in Manhattan. There's some issues that automatically just sort of generates around like gender expression and gendered work and just the culture in general, that became really interesting to explore. So that became like a real segment of the book in its own right, just completely by accident. And it was other just fun stuff that I got to explore, just because I made these, like, I don't want to say random, but really like split-second decisions that ended up having these huge ramifications down the line.
That's one thing I've learned from talking to a lot of writers now, is that I think those of us who don't write fiction often think everything is kind of pre-planned, and I've realized there's a lot of accident in how stories unfold.
Yep. Exactly.
Well, oh my gosh, there's so much there to dig into. I think it makes sense to me that you were thinking of this as a kind of lens for thinking about immigration, because like very fundamentally, this is kind of a story of otherness and about both Chava the golem and Ahmad the Jinni are other in that they're not human, and they're sort of trying to pass as human, and they recognize in each other that they're both don't fit in. And in that way, and it's also this kind of meeting of old world and new world, right? It's like these figures from these old folkloric places and from Europe and the Middle East, and they end up in New York. So it definitely felt like this could work as an allegory of immigration in general. So that totally makes sense to understand now that you really were trying to write a kind of immigration story. And so much is also about assimilation in some ways.
Yeah.
I was also interested in how philosophical a lot of the pieces of this are, because you're talking about kind of nature and otherness, and so much of one of the main themes in the book, for those of you who haven't read it yet, in both books, is that the golem and the Jinni don't need to sleep. They don't have any need to sleep or eat. So they spend all night walking. And so like the pieces that you just heard Helene read, they take all these long walks and they kind of explore, they have these very deep philosophical conversations about, hiding, about who they are. And they're always sort of trying to figure out like how much they're bound by their natures and how much they are able to change and how much free will they have. And, also how much they're going to become more human even without meaning to. And I'm curious whether you saw that as like essentially a philosophical question, or whether you saw that as related more to that theme of kind of immigration and assimilation.
Sort of both, I guess. One of the things that, I in the end, I think I would not have guessed that I would put so much philosophy in the book as I did. But it really did end up like they have these long talks as they're walking, and that end up bringing up all of these issues for them. And I think it again sort of is a byproduct of the way that so much about what is internalized becomes externalized for them, in that they have to figure out, it's not like, how do I, we have these conversations, at like 3 a.m, maybe with our spouses or our rabbis or whatever, but it's like the kind of thing where we don't have to, we can just sort of drift through and make these decisions slowly through our lives. But for them, they have to figure it out sort of as a crash course, because this for them is about learning to pass as human. What does that mean? What does that mean for, like, the golem has she wakes up on the boat on the way to America. She has no previous life. And so everything she's learning is, what do I do right now in this moment? How do I live? Like, she needs someone to tell her how to live. And that's partly like the function that the rabbi has in the who sort of rescues her, Rabbi Meyer. But for the Jinni, he has this whole life behind him that now he has to sort of reckon with. And a lot of this happens, I think, in the second book, sort of like the real emotional fallout for him of having been ripped from his previous life happens in the Hidden Palace. But she is so willing to be as sort of assimilated and become as human as possible. She's like, tell me what to do and I'll do it. And he's like trying to fight it with every ounce of his being. And it's just so heightened for them that I think once you put the two of them together, and I had sort of designed them to be opposites in that way, just because I thought that would make that would offset the things that drew them together and create a real tension. I didn't want them to just like have a really easy time of it together. I didn't want them to just sort of fall in love and be done. I wanted them to really almost like be torn in half almost in the way that they interact with each other, in how they clash, but at the same time just are so drawn to each other. So I think, yeah, again, just ended up being a byproduct of the way I'd set everything up. But I don't know if I could write a book without a lot of arguments. I've been wondering about that lately. It's like, if I do something else, you know, I'm currently working on book number 3. And after that's done, it's like, can I write something else? Would they argue in that book too? Like, if I think I would just end up writing arguments out of habit. I have no idea. I have no idea how to write anything else at this point.
It may be a deep part of your culture.
There is that, yeah.
Right. And I mean, and so a couple of people have pointed this out in the chat that, you know, that as I said that Chava and Ahmed sort of recognize the other in each other, but then of course they're also other from each other. And so they have that piece that draws them together and pushes them apart. And some of that is their different backgrounds. Some of it could be gender. Emily asked a question about why you decided to have the contrast between the promiscuous Jinni culture versus strict rules about sex in Jewish culture, whether you saw that as one of the kind of contrasts there.
Yeah, I think that honestly, that just sort of came up as part of the research, and knowing, you know, what, you know, societal mores were on the Lower East Side among, you know, the sort of especially, you know, the Orthodox population, and just, you know, in America in general at that point. One of the problems that the Golem runs into is that it can't go outside after dark by herself, because if you did that in New York in, you know, 1899, people are going to think you're either a prostitute or you're no better than one. But you know, the Jinni can walk around wherever he wants, and he has, you know, all of these, you know, he has this like previous experience of being, you know, pretty promiscuous, you know, poly, whatever. And now he's just really hemmed in, and it frustrates him to death. And a lot of that came from sort of the myths of, and the stories. I mean, you read the 1001 Nights, and it's just sex escapades like one after the other, and half of them are involving Jinn, and you know, this is the, you know, the personification of like nature and tricksters and you know, an enticement, and so there's a whole lot of that just sort of like built into like Jinn to begin with. So that just sort of became something that felt natural to play around with and pit against each other.
So that brings me to the question of your research process, because obviously you're bringing in you know, these two different rich folkloric traditions, with the history of turn of the century New York. And this book, particularly the first book, only covers about a year or so, I think. But this book covers about 15 years. So including some big historical moments, for example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, a little bit of World War I, also like the politics of class and domestic science and Middle Eastern explorers and other kinds of things. Some of it would be very familiar probably to a lot of people in this room, you know, the Jewish Lower East Side part, and some might be less so, the Little Syria part. So how did you approach the kind of massive job of researching both history and folklore and all these different elements?
Well, my general method is to bite off way too much, that I'll never be able to chew all of it, and just to go from, honestly, just to go from there. So I start off like, oh gosh, when I started at the beginning with the first book, I really did have to do all the research from the ground up. I had no foundation. I didn't know what it was like, what life was like in 1900s in New York, in the Lower East Side. I barely knew about Little Syria. I sort of knew it existed. The fact that they were mostly Christians and not Muslims came as a surprise to me. And so, you know, I've had people ask me if I made up Little Syria, and I'm like, no, you know, and it's all there. And there's a lot more scholarship coming out about it now than there was, at least sort of easily researchable back when I started, which is fantastic. So it was like I had to start with the generals, and reading sort of compendiums of writing from early 1900s. I read a number of sort of immigrant memoirs to get a lot of the detail stuff. I read, oh gosh, just books of folklore. I went having a JSTOR account was very, very helpful because it meant that I could go read a whole bunch of journals, like ethnographic journals from the 1910s, either American or British, explorers ethnographers who'd gone to Lebanon and recorded all of the sort of the folklore from the mountain towns. And, different versions of the golem story, of, the golem of Prague, any number of, modern sci-fi tales about golems. I had to, gosh, what else? It was just sort of like this total hodgepodge. And I would write myself into a corner and be like, I have no idea what this thing would, what would they use to get out of the situation. At one point I realized I didn't know how people told time, because I'm like, if someone's meeting you at 8 and you like live in a tenement, you don't have a wristwatch. This is before a wristwatch, for one thing. And I knew that like clocks were for, fancy people. So what did people do? And the answer, I don't even remember where I found this, was you go to the corner pharmacist and they've got a clock there on the counter, and that's how you know what time it is. So, little details like that. I had to just sort of comb through a lot of stuff. For Hidden Palace, gosh, what was my research process like for Hidden Palace? I researched so much stuff that didn't make it in. There was going to be a whole thing about silent films. I watched like a month of silent films that ended up just not happening. I'm very
familiar with the research dead ends.
Oh God. And it's like, this is all so cool, and I really want to put it in. What else? Like, oh gosh, all of the, I think I actually went to the Jewish Women's Archive website on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. I did a number of historical research websites for Triangle, read a number of like survivor accounts. Gosh, what else was some of the research? A lot of stuff from for both books, from the New York Public Library Digital Archives, their map section in particular, that you can get these huge, they call them like real estate atlases, that's almost like a block by block of Manhattan or Brooklyn, and some of the other boroughs too, but especially, of course, Manhattan, where you can see, from like year by year, which buildings get torn down and put up again. Where if a store is big enough, it's labeled, are these tenements, how tall are they? And so if I've got these people walking around half the night, I basically digitally made myself this giant map of Manhattan, and I could just sort of trace what they were passing and, pick a particular corner and say, oh, okay, this looks like there's an interesting building there. Go back to the archive, find a photo from, that year or a close year of, okay, what does that corner look like? And then to be able to, put a detail in that would make it feel a little more lived. So yeah, a lot of detail work, I think, was how it ended up going down, which means a lot of reference material.
Well, you did a great job, because I, as a historian, get very sort of itchy when things are a little bit wrong. I often will complain about that, and friends of mine who are not historians will be like, there's this thing called artistic license, right? That people are allowed to make things up in fiction. And I'm like, I know, but that would not happen in this way. It's very distracting for the things that I know about. But then there's a million things that in this, as I was reading this, and I was thinking, like, Toby is the Western Union delivery boy. And I was like, I've never really thought about telegrams and how they were delivered and all of that, and what food people ate as they were riding their bike from place to place, and, all of these different details that would not have happened to me.
And that's all like scholarship that I ended up looking up and reading. There's one professor, I can't remember where he is, who like Western Union Telegram Boys is like his thing. That's his beat. And he writes all about like the social world that they lived in, and the fact that they were basically invisible to the city, and that they could go anywhere and knock on any door, and you know, the mobility of, you know, the social mobility of being a telegram boy. And that was just so fascinating to me. That was why I ended up sort of including it, a lot of that.
And Svi mentions that the walking from roof to roof was a whole thing too, right? You have all these tenements, and there was the walks people took on the ground, and then there were all the people who were walking kind of out of sight from roof to roof.
Yep. And I got some of that from memoirs written back in the day, and some of it from like old photographs. If you go back like to the, see, I always blank on people's names when I'm talking. The photographer who did How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Reese. Yeah. He took some of his photos, involved people on rooftops, like standing over the barrels, like, you know, like keeping their hands warm. Call It Sleep by it's not Philip Roth, it's the other Roth, I can't remember his name. It's like, it's autofiction basically. It's like him growing up in Lower East Side in the early 1900s, and he talks about going up on the roof and meeting people and walking from roof to roof. And so, and oh right, oh God, who else? Another historical fiction book. What's his name? They did a mini series of it. It's a murder mystery. And Roosevelt is in it, and it's Henry Roth who did Call It Sleep, right. And I can't remember the name of the historical fiction, but they also had people like running around on the rooftops, and that was one of the books that I'd read.
Right, and we even in our archive have photos of
The Alienist. There it is. Thank you, Sarah.
the visiting nurses of the Lower East Side, like Lillian Wald's organization. And we have some pictures of nurses who were traveling from tenement to tenement, visiting people who were sick. And sometimes they would just go from roof to roof because it was easier than going all the way downstairs and then going up the next tenement, up the stairs. So it was,
especially when they're so poorly lit on the inside and you had no idea if you were going to miss a step and fall and break your neck. And yeah, it was just easier to just stay up on top.
I was curious as I was reading the book if you were going to get to 1918. I was reading it with my pandemic glasses on. And I know you were finishing the book during the pandemic. Did you think at all about adding in a pandemic storyline? Or were you like, oh my God, I don't want to go there?
A lot of that was, it was sort of baked in from the beginning that I would end it in 1915. So I was glad that I sort of narrowly missed that. I would not have wanted to. That would have felt a little too close to home at that point. But also, it just fit. 1915 seems sort of like a natural stopping point. Like you get past there, and it's like once the U.S. starts to get involved, and it's like rising action again. Everything's sort of ramping up. So it was like, okay, I had it in my mind that I was pretty much going to stop it with the Lusitania going down. So yeah, I feel like I lucked out on that. But yeah, I've had that question a number of times about, okay, so did you think about the Spanish flu? And I was like, I eventually started thinking about the Spanish flu quite a bit, but no, I never really wanted to put it in. That would have just been too, yeah.
So in this book, the golem and the Jinni each find another of their kind of the opposite sex. So how did you introduce these figures? How did you develop their characters? How did you think about their gender differences?
It was a long and difficult process to sort of create these two. More so for Dima, the Jinni, than Yasala, the golem. Yasala he was always in my mind as sort of the more traditional sort of lumbering, not intellectually endowed, sort of silent golem. And but then the trick became, okay, how do you make that character interesting to a reader? Because that is always sort of the problem with a character like the golem, or like Frankenstein's monster, or what have you, or at least the way he's portrayed in, like, modern culture in the movies, as sort of big and dumb and silent, which is, there's not that much you can do with that character that doesn't involve sort of bouncing them off other people. And so what I ended up doing was giving him this master, who is an 8-year-old girl when we first meet her, and who he becomes her protector. And they form this very strong bond that sort of leads Kreindl, the girl, sort of helps her. He's like her only friend, because she ends up in an orphanage, and he's hidden in the basement. And so they're like this pair, this duo. And so that was sort of how I decided I was going to get people invested in Yasalo, was because he became as part of a pair. And Kreindl, I thought, was like, I think she's one of my favorite characters in the book. I really like. I ended up really liking her. Dima was tricky to pin down. I had to figure out what her whole deal was. And part of that was, okay, what are just the mechanics of her getting to New York and meeting Ahmad? I had to get around the whole iron thing, because I'd established in the first book that Jinn are basically allergic to iron. And there's no way that you can cross the ocean that isn't on a ship that isn't going to be full of iron. So how's she going to do that? Well, maybe she's like got this very strange, almost like a mutation, that she isn't allergic to iron, and that's what's pushed her out of her society. She's sort of an outcast, and so she's looking for the only other Jinni she's ever heard of, who might possibly understand her. So then I have to get her still to New York. Well, how do I do that? I send Sophia Winston to the Middle East, and she brings her back to New York. Well, how is that going? What is it going to entice? So it's like every step of how is that going to entice? How are she and Sophia going to make this deal? What is the deal going to be? How, I have to sort of design her in order to get her to where she's going to be. And that ended up driving a good deal of her character, which is, I think, why she didn't come together for me as clearly until sort of like the later drafts of the book, was because I just had to keep rejiggering her in order to make her the kind of person who would do the things that she had to do in order to get to the US. Right. And that was to be someone who was a lot more of a traditional, quote unquote, Jinnia, someone who's very brash and slightly immoral, not even slightly, pretty immoral, and who would have to, who in facing off against Ahmad would point out to him the ways that he had changed beyond what he thought of as his basic and immutable nature. If he is faced with someone who thinks the way he used to thought, who is living the life that he used to live, and says, who says to him, hey, throw everything over and come back to the desert with me. How much is that going to tempt him? Why may or may not he take her up on that? And what is he going to learn about himself in the process? So she really was set up to be a mirror to him in a way that was a lot trickier to pull off than I had sort of anticipated. But I feel like in the end, she came out okay.
In some ways, she ends up being sort of like the newer immigrant who comes over and makes the immigrant who's been there for a while realize that they're not so much of an immigrant anymore. They've assimilated.
Yeah.
All the mixed feelings around that, maybe. But I actually also thought her relationship with Sophia was really interesting, because they also have this kind of pair that they're both these sort of wild people who are sort of misfits and are exiled, and grow to kind of need each other in some way.
Yeah, yeah. Who are very, very wary and careful around each other, but who, come to, may or may not come to an understanding as part of that. Yeah.
We've had a couple of questions about why it is that you made it so that Chava and Ahmed, Chava can basically read everybody's minds. She's kind of bombarded all the time with everybody's thoughts, but she can't read Ahmed's mind.
Yeah.
How did you come to that decision?
Yeah, so that came about because I think I was like 2 or 3 years into writing the first book. And she didn't have that in the early drafts. When I first imagined her, she was just she was basically the same character, but she didn't have that ability. And what that meant was that she was a lot less clued in about the world around her. She's just sort of wandering around like a bit of a robot, trying to figure out why people are acting the way they act. Like if you've got, say, two guys, like in like the bakery that she works at, if you've got a boy and a girl, like a couple of teenagers standing in line, and the boy's acting like a doofus toward the girl, and the girl's just sort of, you and I look at that and we're like, okay, he's got the hots for her, and he's, just sort of playing it off. And, so she would be like, oh, why is he acting that way? And it was just, if we know and she doesn't, it introduces a lot of impatience. It's like when a character can figure something out a lot more quickly than the reader can, it's like, okay, get to it. Come on, figure it out. Even if you don't mean to, there is that sort of like, you're just waiting for the shoe to drop. And so what the feedback I was getting from readers was, she's just too slow to catch on to things. And I was like, okay, how am I going to retain her basic innocence and her ignorance about the world around her while making it faster for her to figure these things out? And I was like, okay, what if, there's a whole lot of what ifs. What if when her master died, like, since she doesn't have that connection to him anymore, it's like she just sort of becomes a radio tower receiving signals. It's like she can't read his fears and desires, but she can read everyone else's fears and desires. And so now she gets these clues, but, so she can tell that the boy and the girl, like, he's acting like an idiot because he's got a crush on the girl. But then the question for her is, okay, but what is that? What is a crush? What is love? And so it brought her a little bit closer, but still left a bit of that room for like the larger questions about, okay, but why do people do that? That made it, I think, made it more fun for her to explore. But at the same time, I can't have her doing that to Ahmad, because there's got to be some mystery, right? There's got to be some, if you can read everything about the person. I mean, I can't imagine how many marriages would end if you could just hear your spouse thinking all the time. I don't think any of us would be able to stand any of each other. So it sort of became important that he remain a mystery to her. In the same way, especially because if she can read him, but he can't read her, that is a huge power difference. Right. And I needed them to be on equal footing. And so that was, I just put in this little sort of hand wave that said, because of the iron on his wrist that binds him into human form, she cannot read his whatevers. And as I'm writing it, I'm like, okay, Helene, that's really thin, but it's like, okay, but it's just like, it's an excuse because I need to be able to, to do this, or else it's just going to fall apart.
Right. But it's interesting because there's all this fun play with language that, like, both Chava and Ahmed can speak in basically any language and seem to speak when they're talking to each other. They kind of move in and out of lots of different languages. And but there's all kinds of interesting stuff you do with language too, because even though they're like, multilingual and have all this language facility, they're also like super freaked out when they start to use human idioms, which I thought was really interesting. Like, I forget there's one that you write specifically about that has, I forget if it's like, don't bite my head off, or off the top of my head or something like that. And they're like very, when those things start to roll off their tongues and feel very natural, it like freaks them out because they feel, I guess, more human and feel like they become too comfortable in human language or in the language that's all around them. And I was curious what you were thinking about that as being, because it seemed to me like that was both about sort of the power of language to really frame our reality and like define who we are, and also the limits of language, that it is kind of constricting, right? That it like, and they need to be able to use all these different languages in all these different ways. I was curious how you were thinking about your play with language there.
A lot of that, I think, came from, I have a friend, her name is Zoe Ferraris, and she, her husband is, she's like just a white girl from the US, and she married a Saudi man. And they split after they had their first child. But she said that his he loved English, and how all of the idioms and all of just the weird ways that we use English without even thinking about it just delighted him. And she wrote an essay about it, and one of the things that she said was that at some point, all immigrants just decide that English is hilarious. And it sort of that always stayed with me. And just the, things that I would start to say and then think, where did I get that from? What does that even mean? I would start to look at things almost from like their point of view. And I'd use a particular idiom, the one that you said that I really like in the book is "Don't bite my head off." I have like this sort of flashback scene where someone yells at his wife while the genie's walking by, and he just bursts out laughing because it's just the funniest thing to him. And it's like when kids hear, the first time I told my daughter was, I think, like 3 or 4 years old, and we're just like riding in the car, and my husband said, what could you go for right now? And I was like, I would really love some chocolate mousse. And Maya just cracked up. And it's like, oh, I forgot, that's funny. Like to say that out loud, what the heck is a chocolate mousse? So, it was like that in the way that there's almost like a childlike state of learning a new language or learning a new culture, where you're like, I am all just thumbs right now, trying to hold thumbs. There's another one, trying to figure out what's going on and what people are saying. But this thing that you're saying right here, that is hilarious, and you guys don't even think about that. So that was part of it, but also just sort of the idea of language being sort of a marker of inclusion and exclusion, and how for someone like the genie, who wants to feel like he's outside, like he is holding himself apart, when he starts to say things like "not off the top of my head," without thinking about it, that is sort of like a horror moment for him of like, oh my God, what am I turning into? And it's something that's so small and subtle that it just sort of gets, it's not something that he would feel comfortable pointing to and talking about, but it's just one of those little things that sort of gets under your skin.
Right. And is very, also connects, as Carol's saying in the chat, connects very much with immigrant experiences of, and as you're saying, sort of being excluded, but also playing around with it. And also when you start to notice that you don't find it weird anymore. And it seemed to me it also connects to the storytelling kind of theme of the book. You start The Hidden Palace with this prologue about storytelling and about how stories can be so different depending on who is telling it. And that also is connected to language, because the language we use then shapes the way that we tell a story. It sort of determines the kinds of images that might be used, or the kinds of idioms that might be used. Did you start out wanting to write about storytelling? Like, was that part of your goal, was to kind of have this meta theme, or did that come more out of the nature of the folkloric elements that you were using that kind of contain storytelling within their DNA?
That came about sort of halfway through the book. And that was a surprise to me. I remember I actually think I have somewhere like the piece of paper that I wrote down just in big capital letters. It's all about stories. That I'd, just sort of what happens, what tends to happen sometimes is like you're writing this whole thing and you don't know exactly what it is that you're trying to drive at. And then suddenly everything just sort of orients itself around, there's enough references or there's enough motifs, a particular motif that everything, it's it's all iron filings that find their magnetic, border or whatever, and they all just sort of line up, and everything just sort of lined up behind the idea of telling stories and the way that stories will differ depending on who tells them, and they change, and they will change and evolve, and really, like, what is a life but a story, and how, and the difference is who is telling it, and that all just sort of appeared halfway through the book, and then I just was like aware enough to just sort of seize on that and say, okay, let's turn this knob up a little and see what happens.
Right. We've had a couple of questions about the relationship between Sophia and Dima. Wondering if you ever thought about having there be a romantic connection between the two, or whether that was meant to be a kind of simmering below the surface energy.
Demon Sophia. I had it in mind that it could be read as such. I certainly, I knew that the possibility was there. I didn't want to make it explicit because I did not think that that was something that either of them would do with each other at that point in their relationship. I can certainly see down the road if that would be, for not, I can see writing it, but I could also see, like, just imagining, okay, where are the characters going to be like 5 years after the book is done? Like, maybe. But they, at this point, certainly wouldn't like admit it to themselves. But like, yeah, Sophia being as closed off to other people as she is, and as lonely as she is, and the same with Dima. They're pretty serious frenemies, and they would have to go through some real stuff in order to get together. But yeah, by the end of the book, I can see it.
I think there's also mutual respect there. It's like sort of game recognizes game. They're like, you're also like tough and outside of the box and don't want to be contained, and will play dirty.
Literally getting into each other's heads too. That's the thing. Like, yeah. So yeah.
Speaking of the future for these characters, you mentioned you're working on another novel. Is it a novel with these characters?
There will be some people from the second book and some people from the first book who are not in the second book who come back in the third book. Some minor characters who come back and are more important. That is the current plan. Lord knows I've made any number of plans about these books before that then get tossed halfway through. I'm hoping that's not going to happen this time. But yeah, I was able to salvage some of the stuff that I cut from the second book and sort of use it as a jumping off point for book number 3. But it takes place in 1930 as it's currently set. So another jump forward in time to sort of the waning days of Prohibition and the beginning of the Great Depression, and a lot of really good meat to chew on.
Yeah, that's a very rich period to delve into, and it's always fun to jump ahead. This book picks up sort of very soon after the end of the last book, and so it's kind of fun to think of jumping ahead with them. One last question that I had been thinking about that relates to writing, I think, or relates to kind of artistic vision. One of the things that came through very much for me in this book, in The Hidden Palace, is that both the Jinni and the Golem kind of have these opportunities to pursue their own artistic visions or their own sort of calling. The Jinni sort of maybe more explicitly through his metal work, but the Golem too, I think, through teaching and through her cooking and she like brings a lot of creativity to that. So I'm curious if you sort of were thinking about that kind of role of artistry and artistic calling and self-expression as you were writing this.
I think some of that, yeah, because I always wanted the Jinni to be an artist, and to, especially from from the beginning of the first book on, and how that ends up being something that he brings to the world, and a way for him to connect to people, to humans. His friendship with his partner, his business partner Arbili, becomes a huge part of that. But also just the friendships, relationships that he forms, like with Matthew, the little boy in the first book, and with like a few other people, like how that becomes sort of a layer to him, and a way to for other people to get to know him too. It ends up being sort of like a conduit of relationships. And for the golem, I wanted her to be very, very good at what she does, because I feel like that's what a golem would try to do. And at the same time, like with the in the book, she like leaves her in Hidden Palace. She leaves her job at the bakery to become a teacher, become a cooking teacher, and it's sort of a growing up for her in a way, because it's not just the job she was given, it's something that she decides for herself that she wants to do. And that was part of what I wanted the maturation of the character to be, is that she is now deciding how she is going to, what she's going to contribute to the world. So I think the artistry is sort of secondary to the idea of what is it that you're putting out about yourself, and deciding on that. And when that changes, what does that mean about what's going on inside you? I think that became sort of an externalization of the different changes and conflicts that were going on inside those characters.
Right, there's sort of opportunity for self-actualization or something like that.
Yep.
But I think it stands out particularly for Chava, because a golem isn't really supposed to have that. Like, she's supposed to just do what her master says, and then of course, because she doesn't have a master, there's sort of a void there, and she's able to grow into that and kind of create her own destiny in some way.
Yeah.
Which is interesting for a golem, interesting for a woman. There's a lot of things to play with there.
Yeah.
What has been your favorite part of exploring these stories? Just as a last final, I know that's a big question.
Oh my gosh, what my favorite, that's huge. I don't know. My favorite part of exploring these stories. Oh, there's a lot that it's hard to sort of unbraid. And I think being able to just figure these people out and shepherd them into into being, for one thing, but also to just follow their lives. I mean, at this point, I'm with the story I'm working on right now. It's like, it's in 1930. I will have described 30 years of these characters' lives. And at this point, they're well-rounded enough that I feel like they're people that I know, and it's like I have to do right by them. I can't just say, we'll forget about that whole part of what they did back then and we'll just start fresh or something like that. I can't do that. I have to, I have to be careful. I have to play by the rules that I've set up. I have to honor everything that they've gone through. And that feels like a privilege. It's also very daunting, but very fun to try to figure out, okay, what can I have them do that feels real to who they are? And it's like, it's almost, I don't want to say they're my kids because I have actual real kids, but it's, they are something that I've made, and it's just pretty fun. It's neat, and it does feel like something that I get to do this as my job, and that's just cool.
It does seem like it would be cool. Well, it's been so great to talk to you. It's really fun to read them. So thank you for both being with us tonight, and also for just giving us this amazing world of myth and history to play in with these really interesting and unusual characters.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everyone who came to watch.
Yes, thanks to all of you for being with us tonight. If you would like to learn more about some of the historical context of the novel, there's some that you can find in our resources at JWA, including articles about the Triangle Fire, about suffrage in the US. We didn't even get to that theme, but one of the characters, Anna, is involved in the suffrage movement. I hope you will all join us next week, same time, same place, for a discussion with Ariella Elovic about her graphic memoir, Cheeky, a head-to-toe memoir. So very different, but will be fun. And thank you all. It was really wonderful to be with you again. Until next time, be well and have a wonderful night. Thanks, everybody.